everyone, and welcome to a Euractiv online debate supported by the European Alliance for Plant-Based Foods. And today we're going to be discussing food for thought. How can we reshape our food systems for a sustainable future? But first things first, as always, we like to have your comments and your questions. So get involved in Slido. You can see the QR code on your screens just there. All you've got to do is scan it and you'll be away to ask all of your comments and questions to all of our panelists who are, of course, waiting for your questions. Okay, so today we're discussing sustainable food systems, but essentially we're going to be assessing the value of plant-based food. Now, the UN estimates the global population will grow to 9.7 billion by 2050. That's going to be challenging for the global food supply. Many already can't afford to eat, and demand for high-protein diets continues. Now, the sustainably conscious amongst you will know that meat production contributes massively to greenhouse gases. The CO2 footprint for 100 grams of beef is 15.5 kilograms of CO2, or the equivalent of 78 kilometers of driving a car. On the other hand, chicken equates to 1.82 kilograms of CO2, whilst on the lower end of the scales, you have root vegetables, tofu, and fruit. So reducing the environmental impact of the food we eat could also have huge consequences for the planet, but also for our health. If you eat meat, we know that it can lead to major health crises such as diabetes or cardiovascular disease. Now, today we know that the attitudes of European consumers is changing. A lot today are thinking more about what they eat and what they put into their body for fuel. Now, plant-based foods and diets are becoming ever more popular as an alternative way to get protein and have a healthy, balanced diet. Now, EU data of the last year suggests that sales of plant-based products have increased by 226% in Germany and 82% in Austria. And just think of the last time you went to a cafe and ordered your latte or your espresso, whatever it was that you wanted to have. Almost every cafe shop now has a wide variety of dairy alternatives. Now, one of the flagship initiatives of the Farm to Fork strategy is the proposed legislative framework for sustainable food systems. It's set to be adopted by the Commission by the end of 2023. It aims to accelerate and simplify the transition towards sustainable food systems. But if we are talking about plant-based foods, we know that hurdles remain: taste, price, ingredients. And weren't we always told that processed food isn't good for us? So, is plant-based the healthiest alternative for a sustainable diet? Are there more levers that we could find in legislation like the Farm to Fork strategy? Well, let's ask the experts. Okay, but first of all, we're going to have an opening statement to set the tone. I'll give the floor to Yasmin Debao. She's the Global CEO of ProVeg International and the Vice President and Board Member of the European Alliance for Plant-Based Foods. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you, Euractiv, for organizing this wonderful event. I think it's really important to talk about one of the most pressing challenges of today, which is building sustainable food systems. We're particularly delighted to welcome the 4 expert policy and science panelists, whose views and wisdom will be the foundation for today's debate. My name is Yasmin Debao, and I'm CEO of ProVeg International and co-chair of the EAPF steering committee. The Alliance, the European Alliance for Plant-Based Foods, brings together like-minded organizations with the mission to put plant-based foods at the heart of the transition towards more sustainable and healthy food systems. It unites organizations across the plant-based value chain, including corporations, think tanks, and NGOs, to leverage collective resources, and it plays a pivotal role in promoting plant-based alternatives. By collaborating with policymakers, scientists, and public health experts, the Alliance works to influence and shape the broader discourse of food systems, highlighting the importance of plant-based foods and diets as a solution to environmental degradation, public health concerns, and animal welfare issues. So, let's start with the context. Now, it has become increasingly evident that our current food systems are placing an immense strain on our planet. Mariam already alluded to that. Conventional animal agriculture and the unsustainable consumption of animal products have profound impacts on our environment. But how can we align our food systems with the European Green Deal and Paris Agreement climate targets? Well, the science is quite clear. There are technological solutions, there are shorter supply chains, but nothing comes closer to helping us achieve the targets than addressing the main cause of the problem, which is the food that we produce. That's why we urgently need a sustainable food systems framework, a bold EU vision with clear targets that define sustainable foods and describes how we measure the impacts. A framework that follows overarching principles and it looks at an integrated approach with other policies. Also a mechanism to follow progress and to hold each other to account. I hope you enjoyed today's debate and that inspires you to take action in any way you can to improve and set up a very sustainable food system framework that will be a long-lasting framework that can actually help everyone, the planet, people, animals. And I would like to thank you for caring, and I'll pass over to the other panelists for now.
Thank you so much. And yes, let's pass over to the panelists. So first we'll start with Anastasia Alvizou. She's the Deputy Head of Unit at the Farm to Fork Strategy at DG Sante. We also have joining us Tom Arnold. He's the Chair of the Irish Food Vision 2030 Agri-Food Strategy. He is having a few technical problems, I think, so we will obviously skip over him and hope that he does come back into the conversation. We also have joining us Isabel Petiotta, who's the Policy Officer for Sustainable Food Systems at the European Environmental Bureau. We have Dr. Marco Springman, Senior Researcher, Environment and Health at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. We obviously have just met Yasmin Dabao, who's a Global CEO of ProVeg International and Vice President and Board Member of the European Alliance for Plant-Based Food. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us bright and early in the morning here on Euractiv. And we'll first of all go to Anastasia.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be amongst these exceptional panelists and to discuss also about this very important topic. I think food is very emotional. I think it appeals to all of us. And what is the future? We had the Farm to Fork strategy in 2020. We are 3 years down the line. And a key element of the Farm to Fork strategy and also of the European Green Deal is to enable the transition to sustainable food system. And that's where the role of what the future framework for a sustainable food system in the Union will bring about. It aims, if you like, to solidify the essence of Farm to Fork strategy and to ensure this enabling, to have this enabling character, to bring about this paradigm shift on the way we produce, the way we consume food. So an internal part would be linking, let's say, the production side with the consumption, bringing also more to the fore the need for an integrated approach, a systems approach, and to ensure that we have a food environment that favors the sustainable food choices. That is, in a nutshell, the ambition of the future framework.
So much for setting that out for us, and we will of course ask you more about that framework a little bit later on. So unfortunately we still can see Tom isn't available, so we will go. Oh no, I hear that Tom is there. Welcome, Tom. Please go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience. Thank you for coming back as well.
Thank you, and sorry for these technical hitches. My role was I chaired for the development of what's called Food Vision 2030, which was the Irish agri-food strategy up to 2030. It was a stakeholder-led engagement. It was the fifth such strategy development since 2000, and we worked for 18 months. And we approved a document which the government approved in August of 2021. And the central objective of this food strategy for Ireland is that Ireland should become a leader in sustainable food systems over the course of the next decade. And we spelled out 4 high-level missions, or if you like, policy directions. And one of those was to prioritize coherent food and health policies to deliver improved health outcomes. Now, this for an agri-food strategy in Ireland was quite an innovation, and we spelled out a number of sub-goals in order to achieve that. So now this strategy is in implementation, and I'm hoping that it will deliver the, I would say, quite ambitious targets we set out. Is that okay for the beginning?
Yes, it is. Actually, brilliant. Okay, over to Isabel now.
Thank you, Mariam, and thank you for having us here today to discuss this really important topic, which ultimately, as already mentioned by Anastasia, represents the core of the Farm to Fork promise and why that strategy has been and can still be groundbreaking. We believe creating a policy framework that can effectively initiate and guide a transition to sustainability for our whole food system is a prerequisite to ensuring our food systems contribute to human and planetary health rather than damaging it, and to securing long-term food security for all. We know policy fragmentation is one of the main obstacles to securing that transition, and we know that we need every part of the food chain to be mobilized and supported to make those needed changes so that the transition can be just and effective. And that's why we need a food systems approach in policymaking. There's historically been a strong focus on the production side, which is, of course, foundational. But if we do want to achieve a sustainable food system, we also have to work on processing, marketing, distribution, consumption, and waste. And policies addressing these different levels of the food chain need to be aligned towards the achievement of common overarching objectives, and they need to be developed in accordance with common principles that should indeed be set by the Sustainable Food Systems Law. And indeed, the theme of today, consumption is a key level of action. We need to address current dietary patterns, and we need to do so without putting all the burden of change on the consumer. Of course, providing reliable and transparent information to consumers is important, but it only works if it's deployed in support of structural measures addressing food environments and ensuring they enable healthy and sustainable food consumption choices. So looking forward to this discussion, and I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Marco, over to you.
Yeah, hello there. Good morning to everybody. I very much agree with Isabel and Anastasia, what they just said. I mean, the Farm to Fork strategy is great as a policy document, and it talks about all the right things. But sadly, a shift towards sustainable and healthy dietary patterns is only included as a qualitative target, whereas lots of production goals are really spelled out quantitatively and can be assessed at the member state level. I would have wished, in order to actually be serious about dietary changes, that there would have been similar quantitative targets, like reducing the gap in sufficient fruit and vegetable consumption, or the gap in reducing meat and dairy consumption. We have all those targets written out and commonly assess how a healthy and sustainable diet looks like in each member state and what that implication has for health and environmental impacts. And indeed, we find in our food system assessments that without dietary changes, there is really little prospect of limiting dangerous levels of climate change or reducing environmental resource use when it comes to land use and other issues. So dietary changes are really at the heart of the issue, and it's dietary changes towards more plant-based diets. They don't have to be completely plant-based, but at least to some kind of moderate flexitarian diets. And if we don't manage that, I think the whole, all the targets that are spelled out in the Farm to Fork strategy will be very hard to achieve. So I hope we can discuss a little bit more the importance of really dietary composition in the whole strategy.
No, definitely we will be discussing that, Dr. Marco. Okay, so let's open up the discussion then. Yes, I mean, because obviously you've already gone, you've already had the opening statement. So I'll ask you then the first question. Talk to me a little bit about personally what your diet looks like.
Yes, that's a good question. I've been vegan for over 20 years. So anyone who says that you kind of don't get enough protein or any other source of micronutrients can see that that's not quite true. I'm quite active and run a lot, so I used to do a lot of races. So what I eat at the moment is just very kind of mainly healthy foods, porridge in the morning, and a nice, I do eat gluten-free bread at the moment, but that's a personal choice. And then in the evening, I have stir fries with whatever, rice or pasta, or just lots of vegetables and quinoa, good grains. So I think I have a very balanced diet. Occasionally eat veggie burgers or vegan fish sticks or whatever that is, that takes my fancy. Occasionally you go for vegan pizza or whatever. But what Marco was just saying is really important, I think, is that you don't need to go all the way. You need to kind of make significant changes. And I think plant-based foods present a multi-problem solution to all these problems that we've just been discussing. And it's really important that we remember that the policies in the EU can make a big difference on people's diet. For example, the Common Agricultural Policy and the promotion policy have been shaping people's diets. They've been actually encouraging people to eat more meat and more animal consumption, just at a time when most people eat already too much. On average, about 70 kilos of meat per capita, which is far too much if you look at the dietary guidelines in different countries. And that's not even including fish or other animal products. So I think we really need to make that shift on a personal level, but also at an EU level. It's about both. You need to put the system in place and then encourage people to eat more plant-based.
Okay, well, let's pick up with Dr. Marco then. I mean, you were saying that you were essentially talking about dietary changes. What does the data or the research say about why people have made dietary changes? Is it because of sustainability, or is it perhaps a mix that people are they might have dietary concerns?
Well, at the moment, at the aggregate level, we actually don't see very many dietary changes. I mean, you spelled out some data of how much plant-based foods increase, but if we look at aggregate data at the country level, diets have really stalled for basically a decade. It was literally a lost decade in terms of improving diets in many high-income countries, including EU countries. So that really points to the importance of changing the food environment and making it easy for citizens to choose diets that are healthier and more sustainable. And that needs to include not only citizens in urban areas where you have a higher uptake of more plant-based and healthier diets. That also needs to include rural areas and low-income households. And for those, it's really essential that there are supportive food policies in place.
Policy then. So to Anastasia then, if the data, as Dr. Marco says, isn't there, how do you then legislate to change the food environment? I mean, obviously it's a kind of, is it a one-fits-all approach to try to get people to eat more sustainably?
I think we have to acknowledge that there is no one-size-fits-all. So the ambition, if you like, of the sustainable of the legislative framework is to become the guiding star, then our North Star towards the transition. How can we that achieve? By having certain common principles that would underpin this concept of food system law, by stimulating a favorable food environment. It's very important to also understand what we mean by food environment. If we can describe it in a nutshell, we would say it's all this, it's the physical, it's the economic, the political context within which a consumer interacts with the foods and engage with the food system and make choices. So far, the emphasis is very much on the responsibility of consumers making the choices. Do we need something more? Do we need elements to nudge, let's say, more sustainable consumption? That's, I think, what the framework will look at by perhaps seeing what is the value of public procurement in that context, by also setting up certain principles for labeling, if you like, for sustainability information, sustainability-related information. and whether there is also the need for a more targeted action in certain areas so that we eliminate practices that are unsustainable in terms of perhaps marketing and advertising. This is an element that we have to look closely at. I want to be clear that the framework will not ban products from the market. It's not about one or the other. It's about bringing the necessary balance that we don't have. Currently, we indeed see more an overconsumption of, let's say, red meat and dairy and so on. We need to stimulate plant-based diets as well. Bring back the balance. I think that's the key message.
Okay, so Isabel, let's pick up on that then. So, she's talking there about responsibility, having balance, the impact on the environment, and obviously, eating sustainably does matter, and there is this sense of responsibility because there's this big chain reaction. It can lead to food scarcity, water scarcity, the environmental and biodiversity loss, climate change, loss of livelihood, and in the worst case scenarios, it can even lead to conflict and migration.
Yes, indeed, the effects on our ecosystems and on people's livelihoods across the globe are rife. They're rising. We are starting to become more aware of them because they've started happening a lot more in Europe as well. We've had the recent cases of the floods in Italy, the ongoing droughts in Spain and Portugal. The way in which the climate and biodiversity crisis are affecting food production and food security across the world are ever more obvious. And this is something that we will have to act on. And at some point, it won't really be enough to act on it gradually, which is why we need to act now. And in terms of an element and an aspect that has become so central in today's discourse and political landscape and policy landscape, on food is the fact that the effects of these crises are really jeopardizing food security, and they are jeopardizing our ability of producing food in the long term. And tying back to today's theme, producing animal-based products is a massive part of the issue in terms of land use and emissions. About 3/4 of agricultural land globally is dedicated to producing animal-based foods, and that ties into a lot of different factors. Of course, food systems and diets are extremely complex and tie back to cultural and identity. But in terms of, if we look at the health aspects, as Yasmin was mentioning, it is possible to have a healthy diet, also in terms of proteic balance, while decidedly reducing the average consumption of animal proteins. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, we've talked about, what makes up or why we should have sustainability. Tom, talk to us then about Food Vision 2030. Why is Ireland making this big push for sustainability? What's driving it? Is it simply for agri-food exports, or is it really to make Ireland a leader in sustainable, agri-food exports? Or just to bring up the population and make sure that they eat better?
Well, as I said, this is the 5th such agri-food strategy since 2000. So there's been a tradition of framing policy in a, I would say, effective and collaborative way. But Food Vision 2030 has fastened on Ireland being a leader in sustainable food systems, I think for very good reasons, both domestically and indeed internationally. And again, one of the important innovations of this is a commitment in this document that there should be coherence between our domestic policy on sustainable food systems and our foreign policy. so that if we are able to demonstrate that we are indeed leaders in sustainable food systems and can produce the evidence for that. I mean, and we're talking about sustainability in its three dimensions of economic, environmental, and social sustainability. So if we can be established as leaders in that, it certainly would be of economic benefit. But it also means that Ireland has a voice in international meetings advocating for the same thing and agreeing to help other countries move in this sustainable direction. So, for example, there are two really important meetings later this year which are relevant to this. And the first one is the stock-taking moment for the Food System Summit in July. 2 years ago, over 100 countries committed to working in the direction of sustainable food systems. And this stock-taking moment is designed to see how far they've got down that road. And the second important meeting is COP28, to be held in December in Dubai. And here, for the first time ever in a COP meeting, the current presidency of the COP, the UAE, have acknowledged the link between climate policy and food policy. And this is a real opportunity to really, look for how we can better go down this road and help countries both improve their climate policy while at the same time working on their own food security.
So Tom, can you shed a little bit of light on how Ireland is using this to really use its voice in this consensus process then?
Well, it played a very significant role in the 2021 Food System Summit, very much a strong advocate for this summit, which was called by the UN Secretary General, and the very first time that you had a UN summit focusing specifically on food systems. And the second meeting in that same year was a summit in Tokyo, Nutrition for Growth Summit, where Ireland made a major commitment to increase its own spending on nutrition in its development programs, and so such that Ireland was the highest per capita contributor to improving nutrition at the global level. So, I mean, the country has been consistently serious about this, not just in terms of advocacy, policy advocacy, but in terms of putting money behind it in support of that advocacy.
And so, Anastasia, then, I mean, you heard from Tom, Ireland is making this big commitment to nutrition. How are other member states faring?
Well, we have seen that also other member states are coming forward with national strategies, and actually established a governance mechanism. Let's say the platform where we can stimulate the future development of national plans, exchange information, exchange best practices, learn from another. And also, and very importantly, stimulate cooperation amongst the different players in the food system. I think this is another element that has to be strengthened in a way. So we see a movement. We see member states, also other member states, being engaged, thinking how to develop the national strategies. But all these, in order to bear fruit, need to be anchored on a common basis. And that's what the framework will establish, a common basis upon which member states can further develop their national strategies and provide, of course, the platform to exchange views on that and learn from another.
Okay, and so Isabel and Dr. Marco then. I think, Isabel, you were talking about, I'll come to you first on this, you were talking about there needs to be a stronger focus on production, and then you were talking about marketing waste, needs addressing. So talk to us about the kind of main bottlenecks that we see in the different stages of food production to making food systems more sustainable.
Yes, I do want to clarify that I don't think I said there needs to be a stronger focus on food production, but that historically policy has focused more on food production than it has on the rest of the the food chain. And actually, in terms of transitioning the whole food system, or initiating a system-wide transition, we've covered the need for a systemic approach in policy, and for the need for policy coherence in terms of bottlenecks that are there because of, let's say, structural reasons and the way our food system has developed over the past decades. There really is an issue of power concentration in the middle of the food chain, whereby actors in that segment of the food chain, so we're looking at large processors, retailers, advertisers, and so on, that effectively function as a sort of pit stop or translator between messages and signals coming from the production and consumption side, so from the supply and demand side, are sort of actors in this conjunction translate those signals and messages and reshape them. And that is increasingly determined by how concentrated and verticalized power is in that segment of the food chain. And that ties back to our food system ultimately being geared disproportionately towards profit maximization and private interests, and therefore, rather than food being perceived as a public good, but rather it being perceived mainly as a commodity, then there aren't really enough public safeguards in place or regulatory safeguards in place to prevent that from happening. If we look at bottlenecks strictly on the production side, there are a wealth to mention, but to tie back to what has already been brought up quite a few times, there's a massive issue with policy coherence. So where there are, for example, environmental objectives requiring certain adaptations and changes on the production side, and we have harmful subsidies incentivizing behaviors that are not particularly sustainable or continuing to support that kind of behavior. Yeah, so a number of different bottlenecks.
Yeah, and so Dr. Marco, I mean, your thoughts then?
Yeah, I quite agree with that. I mean, I think what is really missing is proper action. I mean, I welcome all those policy documents, and also the Vision 2030 document in Ireland hits all the right tones if you read it. Yet we must not forget Ireland, like many other EU countries, has one of the most unsustainable food systems and unsustainable diets. Over 20% of deaths every year are related to unhealthy diets in Ireland and in other member states. And Ireland is focused very much at the moment on production of animal source foods. So without like properly discussing what kind of diet and food system we want to get at, with spelled out reductions in meat and dairy production and consumption, and increases in fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts and seeds, and so on, we really won't get anywhere. And that needs strict policies. Just having informational measures like providing labels or nudges really won't cut it. The literature on behavioral change is very clear on that. And that indicates we really need multi-component approaches that not only include informational measures, but also fiscal ones, meaning, for example, following a true cost approach where for example, meat and dairy have a cost included of, for example, the climate change impacts, the health impacts, the biodiversity impacts, and so on. If we did that, our research suggests that meat products could easily double in price, which would send a strong signal to consumers to shift away from those. At the same time, you could use those revenues to help low-income households to transition and actually reap some of the benefits that already exist. Similarly, if you reformed agricultural subsidies, as we already talked about, if you had a stronger coupling, for example, of subsidies at the EU level, that what is being supported should actually be healthy and sustainable, and not not ever further basically the production of lots of animal source foods, then similarly we could make important changes towards healthier and more sustainable food systems that are somewhat more plant-based. And we clearly analyzed that in our studies and demonstrated that each of those things can result in health, environmental, and in the case for subsidies and adjustments in health and environmentally motivated taxes, also result in economic benefits. So I think we need to get progress from lofty, ambitious statements to really concrete policy action that spell out where do we want to get to, really at a food composition level. And I think that is really key in this debate going forward.
Indeed. Well, I'll allow Tom to reply to you first. Tom, go ahead.
Well, Food Vision 2030 is very clear, I think, that we need to move in the direction of a more healthy diet. And that does mean for most of the Western world a reduction in meat production, in meat consumption. At the same time, we're also very clear.
But do you agree with what Dr. Marco said about the kind of food that is more largely consumed in Ireland?
No, I mean, I think you have to take account of, national and regional preferences and deeply ingrained habits in regard to diet. So you're not going to get massive dietary change, and as Marco did say, in any short time perspective. What we should be doing is moving incrementally or as fast as we can towards a more healthy diet. But it also has to be said that this is very much a prescription which is, particularly relevant to Western developed countries. The vast majority of the world is not at that level, is not over-consuming animal products. And it's in their own dietary interests to enhance the consumption of animal-sourced food. So I think, big global statements that we have to make radical changes, it actually doesn't help the situation. And I would really like to debate with Marco in a bit more detail, not on this call, his statistic that he talks about 20% of deaths being accounted for, I think you said, by largely contributed by consumption of animal protein. There's no question that the link between an unhealthy diet and poor health is absolutely unquestioned, and we have to work on that. But I don't think statements that there's a suggestion that Ireland should dramatically cut its output of animal production, whether it be meat or dairying, is helpful.
Okay, Dr. Marco, radical change doesn't work, does it?
Yeah, well, whether it works or not is, of course, a matter of debate, but it's absolutely necessary. So the 20% of attributable deaths due to poor diets, that includes all kinds of dietary aspects. A big portion of it is high consumption of red and processed meat, but it's also underconsumption of fruits, vegetables, and other healthy foods. And that 20% is very similar in lots of high-income countries, including Ireland. So, if Irish public policy is serious about people's health, then they ought to help consumers shift diets to something that is healthier and more sustainable. And incremental changes really won't do very much there. I should also say it's a well-treaded line to say that, there is an underconsumption of animal source foods in low-income countries, and therefore we ought to export those. But that is actually not true. If you look at the data for the aggregate for even all low-income countries, shows that even low-income countries at the moment already consume more red and processed meat than is considered healthy and sustainable. That is something that has changed over the last years, but sadly, lots of people still have this narrative that, we just export our way out of it, and in a way, our responsibility of structurally changing our food system out of it by exporting unhealthy and unsustainable foods abroad. What is very clearly needed in low-income countries is the increase in nutritious plant-based foods, which are woefully under-consumed in those contexts. That doesn't mean, again, that there shouldn't be any meat or dairy consumption, but at current levels, you can look at the numbers, and it's very clear. On that, I should probably also say how we know what is healthy and sustainable. So what I'm talking about is an outcome of a very comprehensive scientific review of the literature on healthy eating and a comprehensive environmental assessment of food systems and diets globally and in each country that we conducted as part of the Eat Lancet Commission on Healthy Diets from Sustainable Food Systems, where a range of academic experts from different disciplines came together to spell those things out. So this is all in the published literature, and the numbers are all there. So I would really encourage basically sticking to the science here.
Stick to the science. Okay, so Yasmin, coming to you then. Now, your alliance, I believe, is calling on the EU to set target of shifting 40% of current consumption of animal-based products to plant-based foods, including plant-based alternatives by 2030. Is this target realistic?
Yeah, I think what we've just heard is that the science is very clear, and I think we need to have an evidence-based approach. The overconsumption of animal products is very drastic in the EU, and that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about the rest of the world. Of course, health and nutrition is important in the rest of the world. We're not applying this 40% reduction to the rest of the world. We're applying that to the EU, where that's necessary for health reasons and for environmental reasons, as Marco just outlined so clearly. So I think the 40% is a very bold target for 2030. We have 7 years, and we need to do this within 7 years. If we don't do this, we will see runaway climate change. We will probably see that the 2-degree heating limit will be exceeded by 2030. So we have no time to do incremental changes little by little. It's too late for that. We've been trying that approach for the last 10, 20 years. And the kind of individual responsibility, as Marco said, you can't put all the responsibility on individuals. We've got to have a framework, the Sustainable Foods Framework, to set that target and to be bold about public procurement, and where we actually set targets for public procurement. We need to look at fiscal measures, as Marco said, like VAT. And we have situations in member states where dairy products are cheaper than plant-based dairy alternatives. And that is, not helping the consumer make the healthy choice and the sustainable choice, the easy choice. We need to make it affordable for everyone. And I think labeling is also important. We need to be able to call a veggie burger, and plant-based milk, because the consumer is using these products in that way. They are using that to choose the alternative for meat and dairy. If we make it difficult for them, if we find ways to kind of put them off with the labeling and make it difficult to find those products, then they're going to make it even more difficult to consume these products. So I think labeling, denominations, setting targets in the protein strategy, in the Sustainable Food Systems Framework, and VAT, other fiscal measures. We need to look at all of these measures to make the plant-based foods attractive and healthy, because they are healthy and sustainable, and they need to be consumed in much larger quantities. And we're saying 40% on average. So some people may well go like myself, 100% vegan. Other people will become flexitarian. That's fine, but we cannot sustain to continue eating 70 kilos of meat per year or more per capita, and then also tons of fish, eggs, and other dairy products. So this is not sustainable. We've got to be more bold.
Okay, so just a quick follow-up then. I mean, obviously you think change needs to happen yesterday, but, you know, there's lots of things that obviously we can do, but why do you think the message really isn't getting through when it comes to plant-based foods or eating sustainably? Why are we still, you know, as a public still, you know, wanting to have our meat and to have our more traditional national diets? Why don't people believe the message yet?
They are, but there's a lot of misinformation that suits certain sectors of the food system very well, that kind of capitalize on the current inflation. Of course, that's really bad for everyone. It hits everyone, but it hits certain sectors harder. So we need to make sure that people can afford the healthy and sustainable food options that they need for their own health and for public and planetary diets as well. And I think we need to encourage that. As I mentioned, VAT, it shouldn't be the case that plant-based options are more expensive than meat and dairy. In fact, it should be the other way. As Marco said, we should look at the externalities of the costs that are associated with meat and dairy products. If you look at all the river pollution here, I'm based in the UK, pretty much all the rivers are polluted because of animal agriculture. The River Wye in Herefordshire is completely polluted because of chicken farming there. And if you actually included the cost of that cleaning up of the rivers into the animal products, the products would be far more expensive. Also, they're currently very much subsidized by the Common Agricultural Policy. You know, they shouldn't be subsidized. Why? We don't do that with cars, do we? We are now actually moving away with heavy polluting cars like diesel to better car systems and electric vehicles, and we're incentivizing that. The same should happen. The same principle should happen. It's not all about the individual choice. It's about the policy environment, the food environment. It needs to be attractive. We need to invest in research and innovation as well. Some of the products are maybe not good enough yet. So let's really be serious about this and put more money into the Horizon project and find out what great products we can make with pulses, with healthy ingredients, and make it really appetizing and appealing for people.
Okay, so Anastasia, do you provide enough incentives? And there was a point that one of the other panelists made earlier, and we saw what you said there as well, about an increase in better agri-subsidies as well. So please, go ahead.
Yes, if I may, I would like also to make a link to what Yasmin also mentioned in her intervention. I believe food is very much entrenched on culture. This is something we need to acknowledge if we want to move forward. We have food is emotional. We are emotionally about food. So it has certain particularities, food as such, that makes the transition, which already, anyway, a transition is always painful. It's always difficult. So there are some, how can I say, inherent difficulties that we have to overcome. So when these are piled with additional elements, let's say obstacles that do not facilitate the easy choice, the combination, the aggregation of these factors makes the choice difficult and makes the transition difficult. I think what we see overall is the broader acknowledgement from all food system actors, from the consumers, from the governments, but also business operators, that we need a transition. We all agree on the goal. We may disagree on the how, but we all agree on the goal. So the farm to fork strategy basically brought to the fore, was also part of the Green Deal, a mechanism how to address this for the next few years. What the framework comes, as I said in my opening, is to solidify this, not just as a statement of the Commission, but as an ambition and as a goal of the two co-legislators. So we are moving from a communication document into a legal document that actually provides the direction where to go. Now, in terms of incentives, yes, we would like to stimulate more the food environment. That's where we do not see too much action. There are two ways, if you like. Two instruments that we are thinking about is more the labeling, but then again, not only labeling, because sustainability-related information, the provision of sustainability-related information puts too much the burden on the consumer to choose. But that is not the only aspect. We need to do more. Public procurement is an untapped opportunity. Their member states could also meet up to their guidelines and step up efforts. We can do more on food waste. We can do more on short supply chains as well. I think that's where we would like to focus on. And an important element is governance. I keep repeating, we need to talk to one another. We need to acknowledge differences, but we also need to learn from best practices and to provide that platform. We need to engage with member states, with food system actors, potentially with food councils, if they are created, where they're created at local or regional level, to provide a voice for this transition. Transition is not painless, but it can happen, and we aim to make it happen.
Isabel, are they making it happen?
Sorry?
Are they making it happen?
Undoubtedly, as I mentioned, and I think others as well have mentioned, I mean, the farm to fork strategy and the prospect and idea of a framework law for sustainable food systems is a very important sign and a very important step in the right direction. I do want to second what both Marco and Yasmin have mentioned before. Time is really pressing, and steps in the right direction are, I guess we're at a state where we will take what we're offered, and they are very, very promising and a great sign. And we are aware of the amount of work and dedication that the Commission is putting in this. Undoubtedly, as Marco mentioned, the numbers are there, they're out, they're published, and they have been known for a while. Action needs to happen as quickly as possible. And saying on transitioning diets and food environments, one thing, it's undoubtedly true that how we eat and what we eat is rooted in cultural, personal, social aspects, and the change is very difficult. At the same time, I do want to highlight that between the 50s and the early 2000s, diets across Europe changed massively. So in terms of the normal time it would take for cultural aspects of diet to change, that was a pretty quick change. And the reason that change happened was that there were extremely strong interests in making that change happen. And yes, people can have resistance, and difficulty in accepting new dietary patterns. And what you were mentioning earlier, has the message not been heard? Yes, the message is being heard, but the message is extremely contradictory, and the signals that people get between the information that is available and what they find in retail environments is extremely conflicting. It's not like the healthiest and most sustainable options are the cheapest. They're not the ones that are there colorfully advertised and placed at eye level at cash outs. That's not what's being pushed. That's not happening. So we can give people all of the information they want, but public relations and marketing since the 30s and 40s have been developed to an extent whereby it's not about providing people with information. It's also about considering that very different consumers access retail environments, and their first preoccupation, and this is numbers, is price. And this is not because they don't care about the environment. This is not because they don't care about their health. This is because it's a normal constraint of the reality we live in. We don't all have infinite means and infinite time and ability to access the best available information, reflect on how we want to adapt our choices, and then have the financial means to enact that. And that's really what needs to be targeted. And it needs to go through food environments. It needs to be a food environments approach if we want to streamline that change. But there needs to be dedication to making that change happen, and recognition of the fact that sometimes we don't have the time. So yes, the change needs to be fair, but it will take time. And that's why it requires public support.
Okay, so follow up there with Tom.
Well, I agree with a lot of what Isabel has said. I mean, some of the constraints of shifting to a healthier diet are clear. It's either the power of some of the big actors in the food chain, or just, you know, the pressure on ordinary people to buy. They're basically not able to afford the healthier diet. It's easier and it's cheaper to buy a less healthy diet. So this needs to be recognized, and I think we need, I would say we need more government willingness to commit to creating a food environment which enables people to move in this direction. It also means that I think there needs to be a much greater public and political awareness of the consequences, the health consequences, not just health, but the cost of health of unhealthy diets. And that then should lead, I think, to more, you know, clear-cut action on the part of many governments to see how that can be changed. And that's an issue which applies everywhere. I mean, it applies, I mean, you're getting what's called now the triple burden of malnutrition, both undernutrition, micronutrient deficiency, and overweight and obesity, even in poor countries. So there needs to be a comprehensive approach to tackle this. And I think governments at individual government level, and I think at international level, there just needs to be a greater prioritization of this food system issue and agreement on actions that can be put in place to deal with it.
Okay, Yasmin, I'll follow up with you there. But also, you know, when the other panelists, they've spoken about, you know, food being cultural, emotional, where does plant-based fit into this? Because obviously, as we said, it provides the kind of protein alternative. And one thing that we do know about plant-based burgers and such products, these meat alternatives also mimic the kind of texture on meat. So in some way, they do sort of satisfy, you could say, a meat craving. So what kind of innovation could come in plant-based food? Could we see things like edible fungi, spirulina, antioxidants, amino acids, you know, different kind of ingredients being put into food, so it is healthier, but also takes into consideration, you know, national preferences or culture or the emotion that's attached to food?
Yes, so taste is very important. I think after price, that's the second most important factor. And I think a lot of research and innovative research is taking place. For example, I've recently heard about fermenting peas. You can eat peas directly, it's healthy, but a lot of people have some kind of concerns about it, or they think it's a bit bland or taste of peas. But by fermenting them, you can actually take away the taste of pea, and you still have all the nutritional values. In fact, they all were enhanced when they were fermented. And we also know that other fermented food can be very healthy indeed for gut health and everything. So there's a lot of research that's going into this to make foods, you know, better, taste better, enhance the nutritional values of that. And in fact, one of the main universities is also based in Ireland. We have a project called Smart Protein Project with about 17 partners across Europe, with a leader based in Ireland. And they're looking at upcycling waste from products like beer and pasta and bread making to use those products and create new protein products. So it ticks 2 boxes, mainly reducing waste and also new plant-based products that are very healthy and tasty. And I think that's the kind of research that we need more of in the EU. In fact, we should really shift a lot of the resources away from animal-based research, animal-based food products, to plant-based food products, because that's the kind of shift that we're talking about. You know, we can talk about lofty numbers, as Marco said earlier, but we need to see the action. We need to see the shift of money. That's the main thing. We need to see the shift in procurement. And for example, ProVeg is involved here in the UK in school menus, and we've already helped more than 8 million meals to go from meat-based to plant-based, and the schools are loving it. The children are loving it. They are willing to look at their menus and say, okay, help us. How do we change our language? How do we nudge children to choose the right option? And how do we prepare this food? So we organize catering workshops to give the caterers ideas and inspiration to cook better, healthy food. It's all within the framework. It's cheap, healthy, accessible, etc. We do the costing of environmental footprints, compared it to the animal alternative, and it's very easy for people then to see the impacts. I think that's the kind of action that we need across the EU at all public institutions, and give people the space to experiment and to innovate, and make it easy for entrepreneurs. A lot of entrepreneurs are now leaving Europe because the red tape and the bureaucracy is not helping them. They're going to places like Singapore, for example, or maybe the US, where it's easier to kind of do that kind of research. We need to make it attractive for researchers and food science and food technologists to come up with answers of today and tomorrow for better food security, food sustainability.
Okay, well, I'll bring up that point with entrepreneurs leaving the EU to Anastasia in a second. But first, Dr. Marco, there was an important point made there about, you know, changing the culture from a young age. So is a way to get people to eat more sustainably. I mean, obviously, one thing we haven't spoken about, we haven't really touched upon the fact that there was a COVID-19 pandemic. There's an ongoing war in Ukraine. There's an energy crisis, food crises that, of course, they also further expose the kind of vulnerability of global food chains. So if we were to teach kids from a young age, and for schools perhaps to adopt better, more sustainable menus, is that the way to improve the culture?
Yeah, that can surely be one way of doing it. At the moment, there is really not much in terms of having a sustainable school meal policy. In very many countries, it's not an issue that is picked up at the leadership level with very minimal guidance. The guidance that is there sometimes, when it's there, refers to national dietary guidelines, and we know from comprehensive assessments that they are inadequate when it comes to providing scientific advice on healthy and sustainable dietary eating. Also due to the lack of recommendations on animal source foods. So one way or the other, we come back to this question of culture as raised here. And I mean, I think it's a lazy argument. If we go back, many cultures didn't used to eat so many animal source foods, and the high consumption is really much a recent development that has been fueled by the massive reduction in prices on animal source foods and basically dedicated investments, as you can see in the Netherlands and Ireland. So culture is really determined by relative prices in the food market, which is determined by what policies are out there. So you can get any diet anywhere being in line with, you know, a more cultural diet, if you want so, or an older diet that is more plant-based, right? You have a classical Mediterranean diet that is very low in animal source foods, very healthy. You have classical Nordic diets that look like that. You find examples in almost any country that has a better composition and is older than what we eat now. So, you know, this reference to culture and we can't change is a bit lazy, I think. think. And similarly, so the focus on specific alternative products is also slightly lazy, because we don't have this food environment that actually encourage a healthy plate with a healthy composition. We are in this situation where innovators or businesses try just to replace one for one, but that misses also the mark, because as Tom mentioned earlier, it's not only the high consumption of animal source foods, it's also the under consumption of fruits and vegetables. So from a public health perspective, we really need to tackle everything that we have on the plate, and not only one product here and one product there. And that really requires comprehensive policy support and changes in the food environment.
Okay, Yasmin?
Yeah, all good points, I think. And I think a lot of the alternatives are used often as a bridge technology or a bridge alternative to get people to shift away from meat-based products to plant-based. And I think looking at increasing pulse consumption and other whole grains is really important. Marketing plays a really important role as well. And I think the EU can again set a good example and not actually continue with the current promotion policy, but move away from promoting animal-based foods to more plant-based foods, whole fruits and grains, but also alternatives to animal products, I think should be eligible for that kind of promotion. And what we also just discussed about children, one other example is the school scheme, of course, where children currently get fruit and veg and dairy milk in schools. What we're calling for is also for children to access alternatives to dairy milk, such as unsweetened fortified plant-based milks. And that's really important for children who cannot tolerate milk, but also who choose not to drink milk, and who want an alternative and don't want to feel like they're missing out. So that's another example where the EU school scheme can make a policy change in the right direction. We've seen some opposition, but we're hoping still that later this year we see a proposal from the Commission that allows children to choose. We're not even saying, get rid of all the milk. We understand that that's part of the scheme, but we do want to see an inclusion of plant-based alternatives so children have an option. And I don't think that's too much to ask. It's just one practical example, again, of making it easily available and accessible for people.
Okay, well, listen, we're going to go to the audience now, panelists. We have a question from Michael. Anastasia, I'll come to you for this one. Michael says, agree on importance of labelling and greening public procurement of food. One obvious step would be to stop EU-funded promotional campaigns for meat and dairy products. Do you agree?
I think Yasmin also touched upon it. We need to address, and promotion policy is mentioned in the Farm to Fork strategy as one of the policies to be reviewed. So yes, we need to bring back the balance, and that's what we have lost: the overconsumption of dairy and red meats and under consumption of plant-based products, nuts, fish, if you like, even, and vegetables, fruits and vegetables. Yes, we need to revisit. The Farm to Fork strategy did precisely that. So we are in the process of materializing. The EU school schemes is one of the actions to be reviewed, as very well said by Yasmin, that we need to see a bit more there.
Mark, I'll come to you with this one because Torben says he agrees with you. He says we need action. And speaking of the EU, what about a more efficient and faster novel food procedure? No endless discussions about categories. If a plant-based sausage is a sausage, it's a sausage.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, I see this discussion as missing the mark slightly. I mean, I for one don't really care how you call the food, as long as you have a healthy composition on your plate. If we look at the studies, I mean, all those processed plant-based products, they do have higher greenhouse gas emissions because they use fairly energy-intensive shearing machines very often to mimic the structure of meat. So if you compare, for example, unprocessed legumes with like a plant-based burger patty or sausage, then very often you have 5 times the emissions associated with those products. They're still much less greenhouse gas intensive than the animal products they seek to replace. But the emission saving is much less so than with unprocessed foods. So with unprocessed foods, you have a factor of 10 to 100. With processed ones, more a factor of 2 to 20, something like that, 5 to 20. So you're missing an opportunity here, I think, if you're not talking about creating more plant-based meals instead of plant-based products. And similarly, so we see that with potential health impacts. So you only address maybe the red and processed meat portion of the equation, but you miss basically 3/4 of the foods that are important for the diet-related disease burden. In addition, very many of the processed plant-based products, they include lots of additives, high amounts of sodium. So it's they're most likely healthier than processed meat and red meat, but it's not so clear if they're actually healthier than, for example, white meat and fish because of all those additives and the high sodium. So whereas for unprocessed products like legumes, nuts, fruits and vegetables, whole grains as well, it's very clear that they are much healthier. So again, I can only encourage that we somehow don't lose sight of the diet equation here.
So Dr. Marco, then follow up. So do you think there's been too much of a rush to rush out all of these plant-based solutions, and especially the meat alternatives? Because, I mean, for anyone that's watching, someone who's thinking, okay, I need to change up my diet. I'm being told I shouldn't eat meat. It's bad for the environment. But then they're hearing you, or they're hearing this discussion. And, as I said in my introduction, we've always been told that don't eat processed foods. They're bad for you. Go for the fresh food. So there's so much confusion for the consumer, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. And I think lots of the confusion exists. For one, you have lots of food companies who want to sell their product, so they market as much out of it as they can. Then you have politicians who continue to say, oh, our meat and dairy is the healthiest meat and most sustainable meat or even food product as such that is there. You hear that very regularly by politicians, which is completely inconsistent and scientifically wrong. So I totally get that consumers are confused. When it comes to research and the academic side of things, the recommendations, what is healthy, has been the same for really decades. So it's very clear that what you need to have on your plate every day is like 5 to 6 up to 8 portions of fruits and vegetables per day, and really meat and dairy only in moderation. So, for example, in the Eat Lancet Commission, we spelled out how a healthy and sustainable dietary pattern can look like. And according to this, you should have at least 5 portions of fruits and vegetables per day, 1 to 2 portions of legumes per day, 1 to 2 portions of nuts per day, whole grains instead of processed grains. And in moderation, you should have basically not more than 1 serving of red meat per week, no processed meat, not more than 2 servings of poultry per week, not more than 2 servings of fish per week, and if you have dairy, not more than 1 serving a day. So if you spell that out, you can have a very varied diet and only need to include, so to say, 2 days a week where you should try to be vegetarian or vegan, but it really needs to be all in proportion, and most of your plate should be basically very colorful, full with fruits, vegetables, and so on, and no processed grains. And if you stick to this, and these recommendations are really, they are consensus recommendations that have been out in the public health sphere for forever, and they're underpinned by really strict and rigorous epidemiological research. If you stick to this, and you can have any kind of ethnic, national food preference diet that you want that is in line with these, even going up to completely plant-based diets or relatively more pescatarian diets. That is all fine. But the key aspect is if you stick roughly with those proportions, you're fine. You don't need any, new food product to be healthy and sustainable. You just need to get the composition of your diet right.
Okay, Isabel, follow up with you on that then.
Follow up.
Yeah,
do you have a specific question? Sorry, Mariam.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, Dr. Marco, though, was essentially saying that, you just need to essentially eat better for yourself. So how much of a confusion then is it for the consumer? They know that everyone, I think, knows that they should eat better. But if these new products that are coming onto the market, the plant-based products, if their ingredients aren't quite right, then they're not the better alternative.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying that. Sorry. Yes, well, I think this ties back really to what we were talking about earlier in terms of making sure that the burden of the transition is not entirely on the consumer, because yes, we can improve information to consumers and so on and so forth, but ultimately it's a very complex reality that we face when entering the retail environment, and that's why it's extremely important for policy to act on food environments at the retail level. But as we were just mentioning, childhood and children and cultural aspects of diet, that's where, for example, public regulation of public procurement, public and private procurement can really come in and make a difference and create food environments in which, in fact, that complexity of the choice is reduced by regulating what's made available and ensuring that what is made available is healthy, nutritious, attractive, and sustainable. And that also obviously ties into specifically composition and recommendations. These are established at the public level. We have this great opportunity of the Sustainable Food Systems Law, where, of course, there are issues of competence. So at the EU level, the EU can set some strict criteria for public and private procurement. It's got a great track record of limiting marketing of substances that are unhealthy. So it can act on that, and it can encourage member states to act on those levels that are of national competence, such as national dietary guidelines that should be reviewed and aligned with that scientific consensus that Marco was just referring to. So I think making sure, if we concentrate on making sure that the burden of change is not entirely on the consumer, then yes, awareness raising campaigns, information to consumers can be there as complementary policy measures to sort of facilitate the transition and facilitate health and sustainable choices for consumers. But it's really on public authorities to make sure that there is a regulatory system in place that supports enabling food environments.
Okay, well, let's pick up on that burden of change then. Yasmin, I'll come to you. We've obviously been discussing the kind of ingredients that go into plant-based solutions and, of course, their price. Now, Antonella has also asked that question, and she says that meat is currently too expensive. Plant-based alternatives are more expensive, and I think I can concur with that. If you go to supermarket, your fillets of chicken are much more cheaper than 2 plant-based burgers. So is there a plan to adjust the price, and what would that take, do you think?
Yeah, so there's a couple of factors that influence price, of course. So first of all, the price is coming down. Last year, ProVeg did research in the Netherlands and found that actually several plant-based alternatives to meat products were cheaper, or at least the same price as meat. This was primarily the beginning of the year before the major inflation hit, which I referred to earlier, and that threw everything upside down and all the prices went up. But of course, the products, as I said, the animal products are being subsidized heavily by the Common Agricultural Policy subsidies. So they are not reflecting the true price. They're not including all the externalities like the cost of pollution, etc. So if they actually had a proper price on them, they would be far more expensive than they currently are. And when more and more people buy alternative products, that price will also come down. And we've already seen that, not only in the Netherlands, but also in Germany. The prices are quite affordable. They are not quite at parity, and that is something that we need to work towards. And that's, again, a joint shared responsibility by food producers, retailers. Again, the VAT issue that I mentioned earlier, that's a governmental responsibility. So all of these actors need to come together and actually be committed to working towards price parity. We're very keen to do more research into this and make sure that we get a market environment that is competitive. And we also want to make sure that Europe remains competitive within the world, and that we are not getting flooded by even cheaper animal products from abroad that are, kind of the result of slave labor. Let's be honest about it, because it's not just the animals that are suffering, but also people in many systems. And the consumer don't know these things, so they need to be aware about the true cost of products, true costs of particularly animal products. And I think when we get more of a push towards eating healthy, then we will see prices coming down as well in the medium term. It probably won't happen this year. I think we need to be a little bit patient. Hopefully next year things will start to turn around.
Okay, Dr. Marker, you wanted to comment on affordability, I understand.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I just want to mention, I mean, we did a very comprehensive piece of research on the cost of different diets again. And here we actually did find that if you have a shopping basket with the foods that make up healthy and sustainable diet that are unprocessed, then that shopping basket is actually already cheaper than the shopping basket of an average EU diet that contains lots of meat and dairy. So there are already savings that could be reaped even with the current pricing structure, which is totally out of whack. I absolutely agree. But very often consumers are really not aware that a more plant-based dietary pattern is already cheaper and more affordable than the average meat-heavy diet. And on a percentage level, we estimate 15 to 30% savings on your cost of diet that you can have when transitioning to a more plant-based diet. But I mean, very often the consumers also just don't know how to put those together and make a meal that really fits their palate. So that shows really you need both fiscal incentives and strong messaging that portray also that send a signal what is desirable in a society. So just one or the other doesn't work, but probably we need both together.
Okay. Tom, I'll come to you next with the next question. Mila says, do you think the adoption of anti-meat policies might provoke active protests of people in member states? I mean, we can't go around banning and saying it's bad because we don't actually know what is better, what is not, right?
I think there's limited scope for diktat in terms of food policy as to what people eat. I mean, people have to be persuaded, I think, that they to move in the direction of healthier diets. But I'd like to maybe just as we come to the end here, broaden this conversation a little bit. I mean, our discussion has necessarily been largely on the realities here in Europe and EU policy, etc. But the wider question of the role of food in the world and its importance has really come to the fore in the last, I would say, 5 years. The fact that the UN Secretary General called the food system summit in the first instance, he made the direct link between sustainable food systems and the achievement of the broader set of sustainable development goals. You then had COVID, which brought home to people the many issues about supply chains and vulnerabilities, etc. And in the last year, you've had the impact of the war in Ukraine, which directly led to massive hikes in food prices, but also hikes in fertilizer and energy prices. All of this, and it also brought home to people how import dependent many parts of the world, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, were on exports from Russia and Ukraine. Now, the logic of all that, the political logic of all that, is that over the next decade, many more countries should be looking towards their own food security and food security policies to make sure they are supplying more of their own foods. It's not just, I'm not talking going back to a policy of self-sufficiency all over the place, and because, I mean, trade will continue to be important. But the overall importance of the issue of food security has really moved up the agenda. And Europe, I think, has an important role to play in this, to agree with that changed importance, and to work with many countries that will be themselves trying to improve their food security over the next decade, to work with them to help them to do that. So that's, I think, a perspective on this debate, which I think is perhaps necessary to insert at the end of this conversation.
No, definitely, and thank you for giving us that worldview to end on. We've got a couple of minutes left, so panelists, I'll allow you all to say a final thought or something that you advocate for. Anastasia, coming to you first.
Yes, well, it was a pleasure to be part of this panel that underlined also even more the need for a framework that we need to set the foundations for the paradigm shift. We need to responsibilize all food system actors. That's, I think, another key message. Also governments, and if I may, I would like also to underline that governments have also the responsibility in their national competence, which is the fiscal policy, which is the educational policy, to do something, to do more. Retailers also, they have to do more. How you place your products in the supermarket, you nudge the consumers. They know the art of nudging the consumers. They can do that and support the transition. The EU has all the elements in place within its shared competence to act upon it. Farm to Fork strategy was a major first step forward. We need to do the next. We need to come now with the framework to solidify the ambition.
Well, hopefully you do. Tom, over to you.
Well, I would agree with that last comment from Anastasia. I mean, I do think governments need to be actually more active in this area of food space, essentially creating a food environment that's conducive to moving towards moving the consumer towards better consumption patterns. But we haven't mentioned at all right through this conversation the importance of the people who actually produce the food. And this is where I come back to this definition of what is sustainability, and it has to have elements of economic sustainability for the people who produce the food, environmental sustainability, which makes sure that the environmental footprint increasingly is reduced, and social sustainability, and this is about rural communities and how they fulfill their job of producing food, but also have other opportunities to continue to live in a reasonably well-developed rural society. So I think these elements are, that's part of the wider picture, which ultimately our strategy in Ireland, Food Vision 2030, attempted to capture.
Thank you so much, and great point to make. Isabel, over to you.
Yes, thank you, and thank you also, Tom, for mentioning the importance of the people producing our food. Maybe I'd like to close recognizing that the transition we've been talking about really clearly requires a massive mobilization of political will, awareness raising, and organizational capacity. And the Sustainable Food Systems Law can be the first inaugural step to achieve that transition. We need to achieve that transition to a sustainable food system through a just transition. And in order to do that, we will have to make sure that everyone is a contributing element in building a food system in which healthy and sustainable food is easily accessible to everyone as a rule, and in which people and animals along the whole chain, at home and abroad, are guaranteed full enjoyment of their rights. And we will have to recognize the dire power imbalances that are currently delaying that transition. But luckily, we really don't have the luxury of time. And luckily, we do have the answers in terms of policy measures, public procurement to address food environments, agroecological models at the agricultural level, alternative food networks, food policy councils that are changing and transforming urban food environments across Europe do provide ways forward. And we need the policy structure to incentivize that and ensure they are picked up across the board. Yes, our current prospects in terms of climate change and biodiversity crisis and food security are dire, but that might just mean that we get the opportunity of creating a better food system. So it's not all bad.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Marco.
Yeah, I think it has become clear that we really need consistent and clear targets for change, to support the dietary transition towards healthier and more sustainable diets. Those targets should be flexible enough, of course, to be adoptable in every member state and in general, meaning they shouldn't be overly prescriptive, but at a food group level, that is very much possible here. Then I think we need clear policy measures like adjustments, healthy and ecologically friendly tax reforms, including VAT reforms, true cost accounting, maybe an inclusion of agriculture in the EU ETS, and a really healthy and sustainably motivated reform of the CAP that further goes, the Common Agricultural Policy that further goes into that direction. And then lastly, also really consistent messaging where really all government departments are on board with basically the discussion of where the science is on healthy and sustainable eating. And maybe lastly, stop in just empty rhetoric that talks about lofty goals of regenerative agriculture or organic agriculture to actually going down to the weeds of what actually makes a difference.
Basics right then. Great. Yasmin, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I concur with what's been said already. We are also mindful that a vision and recommendations alone are not enough. As we gather here, we recognize the urgency and the complexity of the task. The time for incremental change has passed. The urgency is requiring a fundamental change now. And only through bold and comprehensive actions can we build a resilient and equitable food system that harmonizes our planet's resources and safeguards the well-being of present and future generations. Food security was mentioned. It's very much part of all of this. And the world would be much more food secure if it was much less reliant on animal products, because that's the fast user of resources such as water, clean water, and energy, etc., compared to plant-based food. So we really must shift in the direction of a more plant-based food system. And the EU can demonstrate its commitment by putting together a very solid sustainable food systems framework, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, preserving biodiversity, empowering farmers to embrace better practices, and rejuvenating our soils. Also, we haven't talked about soils, we haven't talked about antimicrobial resistance, etc. There's so many topics that are all interlinked. There may not be silver bullets to change, to fight climate change, but transitioning towards more plant-based foods and diets can give us a big head start, I think. And we need to seize the opportunity now to be the catalyst for change within Europe and pave the way forward for a more greener and sustainable future.
Thank you so much. Well, there is just so much to talk about, and I think this is just one conversation, and many more to come. You guys spoke there about change, clear targets, information, incentive, policy. All of these things need to be pushed forward if that change is going to come. Thank you, panelists, for a great debate, and thank you to all of our audience for watching with us. I'm Mariam Saidi, and I hope today has given you perhaps some food for thought as you now look towards your lunch. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a Euractiv debate in collaboration with the European Alliance for Plant-Based Foods. Take care and bye-bye from all of us.